evening, everyone. How are you all doing today? Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I am really, really excited at this event, and not just because it's my first one that I get to do in, I think, like 3 weeks. I don't quite know how it happened that I didn't get to do them, but I'm back now. So, today I've got Marina Lostetter, as she's the author of Numenon and Numenon Infinity. Her newest novel, The Helm of Midnight, is her first foray into fantasy. Originally from Oregon, she now resides in Arkansas with her husband, Alex. When not writing or drawing, she can often be found reading speculative fiction or playing it. She enjoys a good zombie-themed board game now and again. And she does all of it while globetrotting. So first of all, Marina, thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So before we start talking about the books, I have to ask, because, globetrotting, and that's not a thing that we are really able to do as much right now.
Not currently.
Yeah, I like the immediate...
I haven't currently been globetrotting, just FYI.
Exactly. Anyone who's listening, no, Marina is following the rules.
Yes.
What's the spot you're most excited to go to once that's a thing again?
Good question. Oh, there are lots of places I would like to go. Probably the home is the
Yeah.
The first one. I'd like to go to Oregon. That's where my parents are.
Oh,
that's where my siblings are. So back to Oregon, I guess it's probably the first place that I would like to globetrot to.
Oregon's great. I've got friends who live out in Portland. I've been out there a couple of times. I've been to Astoria, which I think I fell all sorts of in love with. So, yeah. Oregon is spectacular. But let's change gears. I don't want to sit here and talk about travel plans the whole time, although I could. Let's talk a little bit about your book. So, first off, what was sort of the spark for The Helm of Midnight? Because it's a really unique story.
Thank you. It actually started out as a short story.
Mm-hmm.
So the novel itself is told in 3 different points of view. And Melanie was actually the original point of view character in the short story. And part of that short story, or basically an expanded version, is her first few chapters. And so Melanie basically is a country girl who has to go to the city in order to find the death mask of a healer who is the only person who really has the knowledge to save her mother. Mm-hmm. So when I sat down to write the story, the short story, I was just kind of like looking for elements in my close environment to include into it. And my husband and I just recently got married. We came back from our honeymoon from Costa Rica. And while we were there, we bought these Baruca masks. And there's Baruca artisans who just carve these beautiful, beautiful balsa wood masks. And we had 2 of them. And they have so much personality that I was just like, all right, what if they were really imbued with personality? Mm-hmm. So then I kind of started on my quest to build this magic system based on 5 different types of magic. So we started with the masks, and that really just kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the world itself. Can you give us a synopsis? I mean, first of all, a synopsis of the story, but then second of all, I really want to dig into the magic itself and sort of how that works. And you already alluded to it a little bit. So you teed me up for this.
Okay. So I know you wanted to talk about it a little bit later, but I feel like to really set up the book, I need to give the pitch, right? The elevator pitch, which is that it's Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn meets Hannibal, right? So I feel like that pretty well encapsulates the feeling that I was going for overall with the story. So Arkansas itself is just a valley, and it is a protected valley by the 5 gods. And outside of the valley on the rest of the planet is all wasteland controlled by the creator god, the Thallo. And there are monsters everywhere. So the only place that humans can be safe is within the valley and the god-created border. And then there are 5 gods, and each of them basically has bestowed a type of magic into the land. And then the different elements can be harvested and then imbued in enchantments. Mm-hmm. So this structured magic comes in.
What if I can ask, what are those 5 elements? How does that work?
Basically, wood and... So there's 5 gods. I'll just start with the gods. Okay, so there's knowledge, emotion, time, nature, and the unknown.
Okay.
And each of the 4 that are not the unknown have sort of not a literal element, but a environmental element that goes with them. So wood and knowledge are connected, therefore you get the death masks. Emotion and gemstones are connected. Time and glass or sand go together, and then nature is in metals, because nature magic in my world is more like just evolutionary magic and transferal magic.
Okay.
And then the unknown is unknown. Nobody knows really the aspects of that god or what their gift is, and some people hope to uncover it.
All right. So then we now have a bit of an understanding of kind of how this world came to be and sort of where our place in it is. What's going on in this story? What's the snapshot we're getting?
We start off with a heist.
Of course. So
the main point of view character, her name is Marina. She's a regulator, which I kind of think of as like a white collar FBI agent, individual, like a white collar crime. Yeah. So she's in charge of enchantments and making sure that they are safe and that they are all licensed and well regulated, right?
Yeah.
So we start off at a banquet where basically the person who's in charge of the law enforcement system is celebrating a jubilee. And so very dangerous magical artifacts that were captured during his time leading the law enforcement division are on display, which is, of course,
too tempting.
Too tempting. It's the impetus for the story where Louis Charbonne, or however you want to pronounce his name, I'm okay either way. His death mask, he is a serial killer that was hanged 10 years previous. His ability to dissect a body and his echo were preserved in his death mask, and that mask is stolen, and then he begins to kill again from beyond the grave. So Krona's job is to recover the mask and figure out who took it and why they feel they need it in order to commit these copycat murders.
I really love, by the way, the hubris of, look, we have all of these horrible weapons of mass destruction. Let's just put them in one place and have a big party.
A big party, it'll be great. It'll be fine.
So
nothing bad could possibly happen.
Exactly, nothing could ever go wrong with this. You've built a really cool, kind of scary world. And one of my favorite questions to ask people who build these worlds is, okay, where would you want to find yourself in this world? If you said, you've got to live here, who are you in this world then?
Oh no,
I know,
it's
right?
very complicated because so it is a lot of the thematic elements are about being cogs in a bad system and what different cogs do to perpetuate that system. So it's not really a world that I feel would be super fun for most people. It's very hierarchical. What's the word I'm looking for?
That seems right.
There's a hierarchy that is dramatic. Obviously, I feel like in most things you want to be the like rich, well-to-do person, but also that means that you're the person who's benefiting from all the suffering. Right?
Yeah. See, by the way, that was a great way to answer it, because you managed to avoid telling us that you would definitely be the person at the top. You would be the despot, and that's fine. That's I can respect that. So let me ask you a slightly different question then. And we talked a little bit about this before, sort of the show. You've written other books, but this is your first fantasy. What were some of the differences and similarities between writing this and writing other books? Were there any considerations where you went, I have to remember that, I have to include the magic in this scene. Now, it's been 100 pages and we haven't done anything fantastical. I mean, what was that sort of thought process like for you?
I wrote sci-fi novels before this, but I actually kind of wrote this one in tandem with my first sci-fi novel. I had both of them. When I was searching for an agent with Newman on, I already had this one half written. And I kind of did the thing you're not supposed to do when I met my agent in person, which is I pitched this one to him. And I was like, it's not quite done, but I think Dunlon was quite interested in it.
Yeah.
And so I've kind of been writing sci-fi and fantasy in tandem, and I think they're really close related genres, not just in a, like, audiences are both drawn to them, similar people, but one is about extrapolating real science into the fantastical, and the other's like making the fantastical make sense, almost like science. So I feel like they're two sides of the same coin, and so when I'm writing them, I think I get the same kind of writer and reader cookies from them when I do it.
Yeah.
The biggest difference for me was actually structural, because Numenon is a mosaic novel, and the whole series, they're mosaic novels, which means that each chapter is really its own short story, then they all tie together to make an overarching storyline, whereas The Helm of Midnight is a much more traditionally, structured novel narrative.
Okay.
I'm looking over here because I have the book next to me, so I'm staring. If I keep looking that way, it's because I'm looking at the book.
No, that's completely fine. I have, I have a cheat sheet. I have a sleeping dog. I have all sorts of things that I'm constantly looking off to the corner, like, what was that noise? So then, let me ask you, sort of in keeping with the theme of how you write, and again, we talked a little bit about this before, and I warned you I would do this. What is your process for writing a book? Can you cradle to grave for us that process for you?
Sure. So I consider myself a plotter, although I'm not super strict up front with my plotting. Usually I get an idea, I'm going to mash this with this thing, and then I kind of get a concept for an ending first. And then I open up a fresh document and I do kind of just like a train of thought. This happened, then this happened, or maybe this could happen, or maybe that could happen. And it's usually pretty contradictory stuff that no one but me could really make heads or tails of if they were looking at it. And then when I do sit down to actually write it, I'll often kind of like bullet point myself through chapters, being like, this needs to happen and this needs to happen. And then I'll kind of just write to those points. So plotting for me is very much about having like a goal to shoot for, and then steadily hitting those goals as I go. The one problem with that is making sure that my characters that I am intuitively creating don't try to like run around away from the goals, right?
Right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about character creation then. And I feel like if we're going to talk about character creation, let's start with the serial killer in the room. Louis Charbon, or Louis Charbon, or again, because apparently there's no wrong way to say it, which I am grateful for.
There is no one wrong.
Was there a specific inspiration for this character? Was it your mask? Was it your husband's mask? What was, walk us through the birth of a serial killer, I guess.
Yeah, one of our masks definitely was the inspiration. Like the two masks, at some point I should bring up photos. I think I've put photos of them one point on the internet only once. But anyway, both of those masks do specifically make an appearance in The Helm of Midnight. And yes, one is the serial killer's mask, because it's kind of like a demon's maw type intimidating mask. Yeah. And Carbon himself wasn't actually a point of view character until after I had given my book, my first draft, to my agent. And then they were very like, this is missing something here, and it feels like we need to hear from the serial killer himself, especially since the serial killer is not necessarily killing for normal serial killer reasons. Sure. This isn't just a, guy who's,
revenging himself on the world.
He's evil, but he has his reasons, if that makes sense.
Sure.
He's definitely not a good guy. He's not a misunderstood guy. He is a bad guy, but he has extracurricular motivation that is not typical serial killer motivation.
Sure, and I think that's I think it's really important when you're creating a character, I would imagine, that's going to be a point of view character. While it can be fun to read the unreliable narrator, the crazy person who's like, the voices tell me, and you're like, oh, yeah, well, okay. I think there's something more compelling and maybe more, I want to say the word relatable, but man, that doesn't feel right. Insidious about...
I know what you mean, yeah. And I think also that has to do with our, traditional, not great representation of mental illness as being dangerous, right? So people often fall back on that, but that's not even a really good representation of how that evil is perpetuated. It's often more calculating.
Yeah. And
so I just kind of pushed it all the way in the other direction, where what if it was super calculated evil, right?
I keep remembering a conversation I had with a college professor, I guess many years ago now, which, man, does not feel great. But we were talking about the study of history, and in particular, I made a comment about Adolf Hitler, and I said, well, he was crazy and evil, and what are you going to do? And he said, you can't ever say that, because when you do, you completely dismiss that it's a possibility that other people can, this isn't one person acting in concert by themselves. Everybody has a logos, has a reason why they do the things they do, even if those reasons are horrible. There is a logic behind them, and to dismiss that is very dangerous. And I think go ahead, please.
Sorry. No. I was just going to say, and I think it goes back to, like, sometimes we want to humanize our monsters because that reminds us that the monsters are human. Mm-hmm. Some people go the other way. We want to, like, really monsterize the humans, turn them into monsters because we want to, like, disconnect ourselves from that. But I kind of am pro going the other way. Is the more you humanize the person who did the terrible things, the more you realize that it's humans who do terrible things, right? That, like, we can't totally disconnect ourselves and say those are the bad things over there that has nothing to do with me. And that's how you start to realize that bad things happen in places that you don't often look for them, right? So, like, domestic violence and that kind of thing. Sure. People are often like, oh yeah, no, he was such a nice guy, but was he?
Yeah. It seems like every time that they catch, a serial killer or I guess a spree shooter or whatever, they talk to the neighbors. He was a really nice guy, just quiet, kept to himself, and they're never like, we always thought it was weird that he drew pentagrams in fire on his lawn, but yeah, we just, neighbors. I think that's very fair, and I also think there's something a lot more intimidating and scary about something that feels relatable. While we can be afraid of a shark eating people, that's a scary concept. I don't know how much it really keeps you up at night, because you're like, well, it's a shark, I'm not in the water. It's just an animal, it's doing its thing. Exactly. Yeah. But knowing that someone is actively sitting down and choosing, no, I'm going to do this, and my reasons are very sound in my mind, that is a different kind of scare.
Yes, I think that's a good point. It's about the choices. Like, someone has chosen to do a bad thing. Mm-hmm. There's no other outside, Yep. They are choosing to do this.
No, 100%. Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit. Don't worry, we'll come back to the murdery parts, and let's talk a little bit more about your world. So when you sit down, you already sort of said that you consider yourself a plotter when it comes to writing the book. Does that apply to the world as well? I know the genesis for the world was kind of the masks. It sounds like a little bit, but what's that process like?
I am a make it up as I go type world builder, and then I make it look like it all fits together on the back end of editing. So I'm very much, I just kind of write, and then I'm like, oh, this feels like a cool thing to throw in there, and then I have to invent reasons why it all fits together.
Yeah, absolutely. You rule of cool. This seems like a fun thing, and then later you go, well, here's how it works. I completely understand that.
It's all going to make sense later, but when I'm doing it, I'm just like, oh, let's throw this in here and let's throw that in there, and I'm very much make all the magic fit the rules after the fact kind of a person.
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of as a follow-up to that, I guess, then, your previous books were science fiction, and you sort of touched a little bit on what you feel the difference between science fiction and fantasy is. As a follow-up to that, are there any hard lines where you just go, if you include this is a fantasy. If you include this is a science fiction? Or do you sort of view that, it's kind of shades of gray? Is Star Wars fantasy? Is Star Wars science fiction? It's both.
I think there are shades of gray, although I would classify Star Wars as fantasy. Yeah. I think there's definitely, you push the line too far and it goes into one thing. So I don't think it's like, if it's in space, it's not fantasy, or if it's, in a secondary world, it's not science fiction. I think it definitely has to do with, like, specifically the elements that you are looking at. So like I said, usually sci-fi is in some way an extrapolation of our own physics. Even if it goes into, like, a mystical, we don't know how you would actually achieve that. It's usually an extrapolation of what we know to be how things function.
Sure.
And fantasy is largely about making up how things can function.
Sure.
That still ends up being relatable, and a lot of things still apply to the real world, but it's more about, like, the what if this was completely different, and this is like, what if we evolved this? Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. It's the difference
between different tracks of a similar concept.
Yeah, it's the difference between transporters and the Force. How do transporters work? Sure. You disassemble your molecules and reassemble them. Well, how? Not important. What's the Force? It's a thing that binds us all together. What does that mean? Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Very different, but similar.
Right.
Yeah. So what then made you choose to write in the fantasy genre?
Well, I think I just love both sci-fi. I've always wanted to be a sci-fi and fantasy novelist. So I read both. love both. I consume both. Again, I think they're just two sides of the same coin. So just whenever I can play, I think also as a writer, I really need a balance. I need something I can shift into that's different. I think if I stay in sci-fi or fantasy for too long, I get a little bogged down and very much a like, ooh, new shiny idea type author. So being able to flip back and forth between the two genres, even though they are very similar, it kind of like I get a break from one and get refreshed, while I'm doing the other one.
Yeah, absolutely. So in kind of keeping with that theme of mixing genres, let's call it, you've got a really fun combo here. And, sort of like we were talking about earlier, I'm really become excited as I've seen people who, grew up in the same time as me, reading the same stuff as me, now telling their own fantasy stories, and they're incorporating different elements. It's not all, we're off to get the MacGuffin to save the world. It's a heist and a fantasy. It's a murder mystery and a fantasy. It's a nature conservation story and a fantasy. I'm sure there is one out there like that. Actually, I know there is.
Oh yeah, Vandermeer stuff. All of Jeff Vandermeer stuff is very much nature conservation.
Yeah.
But fantasy or sci-fi. That also toes the line, right?
Yeah, there's all sorts of cool kind of, you got your peanut butter and my chocolate stories now, which I'm in love with. So I guess the first question is, you chose to combine, you've got a serial killer murder mystery and fantasy. And you even said to yourself, it feels like, Hannibal and Mistborn kind of mashing together, which is a great tagline and what I use in the store when I'm going to talk about it. So what inspired that combination? How did those two flavors come about?
I wish I knew for positive, because this is the one thing that people have asked me, and I cannot remember when I decided serial killer.
Okay.
I really don't know. I think what happened was I was like, all right, what is just like the worst thing I can think of to be in a mask? Because because the masks have not just knowledge, but they have some echoes of personality in them. I was just like, what is the worst thing I can think of to like put a mask on and feel in your brain? And I was like, a serial killer, right? Yeah. I presume that's what happened at some point. I can't actually put my finger on it. But like I said, from an early reader standpoint, I was reading a lot of Nancy Drew. Oh, well, we talked about this backstage before we started. I started off reading a lot of Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys, so definitely like investigative mysteries were my like base reading until my dad gave me The Hobbit, and that's when I really fell in love with fantasy stuff. So I think those two things have always just kind of been in my brain. And then definitely at some point when I started writing this, me and my writer cohort, our writers group, we definitely had a conversation at some point about like, why aren't there more serial killers in fantasy?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I as I said, I'm always looking for, I have a whole lot of beliefs about genre fiction in general. And before I get into that, because I think it actually lends itself to a pretty cool question, where would you put your book? Would you put it in the mystery section? Is it in the science? Is it in the fantasy section? Is it in the horror section? Is it in general fiction? Where would you put it?
I think it's pretty solidly in the fantasy. So I think that is the main readership it's going to appeal to, is epic fantasy readers. That then people who also enjoy stuff like mysteries will then also gravitate to. And I think that was part of our issue with the marketing actually up front, and like the designing the cover part, was trying to make sure that we were signaling both aspects effectively. But definitely I think it'll primarily appeal to epic fantasy readers.
Awesome. So then my follow-up question to that is this, and this is, if your editor sees this and they go, oh my God, I can't believe you answered that, blame me. Or just, say pineapple and we'll move on. But I am curious, do you think that we should, as a bookstore or booksellers, that we should have separate genres? Should we just say, hey, look, this is our, quote unquote adults, these are our young adults, these are our kids, and just kind of let it all go? Because as you pointed out, and as I pointed out now, there are universal story elements. Do we have them to help readers find their books? Like, I, as a fantasy reader, do I know I should check fantasy, or should I be checking with my local bookseller who I know knows the stuff I like? What are your thoughts?
That is a very interesting question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that before. I do find separating genre or even emotion, because a lot of genres are emotions, right? Like you're talking about like romance and horror. Like they specifically evoke emotions, right? But I am a reader who beelines for the sci-fi fantasy section.
Yeah.
Myself. So because I know like that's where, again, like my reader cookies are going to be fulfilled. So I feel like I still want them to be separated so that I can just like automatically gravitate to the thing I know I want to gravitate to. But also you bring up an interesting point, because what if there's like a thing you don't know you would gravitate to, and you completely bypass it because you're focused in on your, this is my bookshelf, right? So that's an interesting question, I don't know if I have a really great answer. But
no, actually, I think you gave me a really great answer. What if it wasn't organized by genre? What if it really was just organized by emotion? We went, these are the books that'll make you feel happy. These are the books that'll make you feel sad. These are the books that are going to make you afraid. These are the books that are going to do this. If that were the case,
that would definitely be interesting.
How would you organize? Where would you put your book?
Oh, that one's. Can it be like right between the like fantasy, like sense of wonder and horrified sense of wonder?
yeah, I mean that's Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is horrified sense of wonder. There's you can recreate life. Oh my God, at what cost?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, they would fit right in there.
Absolutely. And speaking of Mary Shelley, and I definitely totally didn't tee this up because the emotional bookshelving was completely random. And man, I like that though. So let's talk a little bit about the fantasy genre, and one of the, I think, more fair critiques that is, I believe, changing, which is that the fantasy genre has been dominated for a long time by old white men writing about chosen boys in a farm somewhere doing their own thing. And I want to talk about representation in particular. Even though I really feel like that's shifting, I feel like the word I want to use is shifting, not shifted. Why
it is, yeah, like it's evolving, right?
Yeah. Why is it that you think that here we are, it's 2021, and female fantasy authors, especially epic fantasy authors, are still so underrepresented, and characters as well?
I think that just has a lot to do in general with our concept of what women characters can be, and what women authors can be. Like I said, as you said, it's growing, it's expanding, it's evolving. Like we're definitely pushing into anybody can be X type of writer, right?
Yeah.
And any character can be X type of character, which is great. But anything's you're gonna have to push through, right? It doesn't just jump to. And now we're all inclusive.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's always that struggle in the middle. And I think. So I kind of play with a little bit in one of my point of view characters, in the Carbone character's point of view. Definitely, I think a lot of people still have the like whore Madonna dichotomy for women, and write that in their women characters a lot. And Carbone, in a way, it's really settled. The misogyny is not super strong in this, so I don't want anybody to get turned off by that. But he definitely has this kind of whore Madonna dichotomy about the women in his life. And I did that on purpose to kind of play with that, because that's often what you see in fantasy. And usually it's portrayed by the like innocent princess or the evil queen, right? You get one or the other. Yeah. So I think just like expanding the full humanity of what we see in people of different genders is important, and in different races. And I think that's part of it, is just we had for so long a very narrow view of what certain types of characters had certain adventures, and then other characters didn't have those adventures. And I think we're trying to claw our way out of that really narrow expectation. So that's just what's happening right now, is the clawing. Yeah. We're still trying to claw our way there.
Absolutely. I also sometimes think that, like, as they should, by the way, I think the goalposts move. I think that in the 90s, there was this thing where, like, no, we're going to have strong women. And strong women, how do we know they're strong? Because they act just like the men. They are tough, and they fight, and there's always, oh, she's a badass, and she doesn't need a guy, and she learned how to fight from her older brother or her dad, or because it's always coming from men regardless. And that was good, and by the way, it was. And then we moved past that, and we're continually moving past that. So having subtle misogyny, or having a character who doesn't think of themselves necessarily that way, and maybe wouldn't have been considered that way 20 years ago or at a different time, but is now, is I think really important also. Because I believe that one of the real benefits that fantasy has as a genre is allowing us to view certain societal issues, whether it's with ourselves, whether it's with society as a whole, through the lens of fantasy, where I'm not rooting for my team, where I'm not like, oh, well, this is my side, and therefore it's right, because if I rooted for the wrong side, I would be bad. And instead you can just go, well, I'm not associating with anyone here, and I can view an issue, somewhat separated from its own stuff.
It's a bit of a distancing and a lens that you can step back in some cases. Yeah.
So I guess sort of as a follow-up question, and I need to think of how to phrase it in a way, because it makes sense in my brain, and then I have to word it out in the world. How do you, I don't want to say, how do you future-proof a book, but how do you try and write something that you go and say, hey, I feel this is a good representation of what's good or right, that isn't going to be a thing that we look at in 30, 40 years and just go, ooh, man, we were trying, but ooh, man. Or do you just acknowledge, yeah, that's inevitable. We're all going to, everything, we're going to look at it all in 60 years and go, yeah, that's okay. It was a different time.
I think that's kind of where you have to be as an author. I mean, even I look back at something I wrote, 5 years ago, and I'm like, well, I could have done X better. I wasn't thinking about that, or I wasn't aware of that issue at the time. And I progress has to always progress, right? You can't ever be like, aha, we did it, we made it, because as humanity, you're never just going to make it. You always have to be moving forward, right? There's always the little things that you can refine and do better. Mm-hmm. So I think really being forward facing and really being up on social topics is really important for an author in terms of future proofing. Mm-hmm. But just trying to stay in the moment and understand what your society is going through and who you're speaking to and why you're trying to speak to them, with whatever you're writing. But also acknowledging that you try to progress and your work is a reflection of who you were whenever you wrote it. Sure. And you're still evolving as a person, and you're not set in stone either, and your understanding's not set in stone. So being okay that sometimes stuff gets dated, and sometimes it gets dated really fast, but always looking forward and trying to make sure that you are trying to be as, keeping with progress as possible, which is often, So the goal is always to tell the next story and to speak to the moment. Any book is really about the moment it's written in, right? Mm-hmm. That's who you're talking to, it's the contemporary audience. So it's really hard to talk to the future when you don't know what's going on in the future, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the only way to do it without completely going nuts. So we've gone down a really deep philosophical hole on the role of fantasy and writing in the world and how we can be the change we want to see. Let's bring it out a little bit. And let's talk a little bit more about sort of your writing process. So how do you go about creating characters that are believable and have relationships that not only feel honest, but feel relatable to us and not just with themselves, within each other, but also their relationships with the world around them? Because while I will tell you, 2020 definitely felt like I'm only safe in this one place and outside there be monsters, it really wasn't that way.
Sure. I think that's a very good question, because the way that I build characters is more intuitive and through drafts and over time. Mm-hmm. So I like to say that I don't really know my characters until I have gone through a whole draft with them, meaning that I try to build them and I try to consciously give them motivations and stuff, but I do a lot of things subconsciously that later I look back and go, oh, that's where this is the type of person I was actually making, and then I have to go back and make it look like I was doing it on purpose. But the first thing I always come at is first and foremost, I'm writing a person, and that might seem obvious, but I'm not sure that everybody comes at it that way. Meaning I'm not writing a strong female character, right? I'm not writing the bad boy. I'm not writing I'm writing a person, just a human being who's trying to make their way in the world. So I really try to empathize with them and inhabit their motivations in a way, outside the base aspects that people might see. Mm-hmm. So that hopefully helps me stray away from writing stereotypes or something like that. I'm sure we're all eventually going to fall into accidentally writing a stereotype. Sure. But I really consciously try to avoid those things by just being all right, I am a person and they are a person, and trying to treat every single, even little minor character like a person, not a prop. Mm-hmm. So I think doing that fundamentally helps then their relationships their relationships feel more real. So yeah, I guess that's my approach to character building.
Okay, yeah. So who would and this is one of my favorite questions I love to ask. If you had to take a character from a different book or a different series and implant them into your world, who would it be? Why would it be this character? And are they going to be successful / happy in this world, or is this about to be a very interesting train wreck?
This is an interesting question. I've answered it the opposite way. Like, I know I would take Melanie, and I would put Melanie in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, because I think it would just be like really interesting to see how she would react to all that nonsense. But I haven't yet come up with a good answer for the opposite direction. I don't know. It would be kind of fun to take a so I have a soft spot for robot characters, especially like, little fledgling intelligence and stuff like that. I think it would be interesting if I could magically drop one of those types of robots into.
So Wally. So Wally dropped into this
Wally. Yeah, that feels terrible. I feel like a bad person. Put Wally in here. But I feel like it would just be fascinating to watch that kind of character who almost never appears in this kind of book.
Oh yeah. So, all right, slight derailment, because again, you answer questions really well, and then I go, ooh, that's interesting.
Oh,
so how would you do a fantasy robot story? How would that work?
Well, actually, Nikki Drayden has done an amazing job of that in The Prey of Gods.
Okay.
So my answer is I wouldn't, and I would just let Nikki handle it, because
all right, Prey is in P-R-A-Y.
The Prey of Gods is a pretty
P-R-E-Y?
fantastic book. So. Prey as in, not praying to the gods, but you are going to be the prey.
All right. I have to read that, because I'm like, how would you do a fantasy? I mean, is it a golem at that point? Is it?
She did a really fantastic job of tying fantasy elements and sci-fi elements together. Yeah.
So
that's one of those books that you're jealous of. You're like, oh, she's so good.